Welcome to Millennial Pagan Podcast. I'm your host, Autumn Wolf.
And I'm Jera Stone. And in studio today, we have the privilege of having J. Allen Cross, author of American Brujería, Modern Mexican-American Folk Magic. Welcome, Jay.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here.
No, thank you for coming on.
Yeah. So we're going to get into the book a little bit here in a little bit, but of course, we always love taking some time to introduce our guest.
Yes, Jay, would you let us know your coming of witch story?
This is always an interesting topic for me because my coming of witch story was not something that I chose so much as something that sort of happened to me. I come from a magical family. That's not to be confused with a family that has passed down, witchcraft secrets for hundreds of years, but we all have, I guess you would say, abilities, and it kind of depends on which one of us you're talking to at the moment to find out what those are. So for me, I started showing signs of being psychic at a very young age, as well as kind of having some sort of witchcraft abilities. And, my mom, she also has psychic abilities and similar things to me as well as the rest of my family. My mom was actually adopted, and I was really young when we found her birth family. And what was funny is, after kind of everyone kind of got comfortable with us and kind of like, oh, you have the family eyes and the family ears or, whatever. Then slowly after everyone got comfortable, they started coming forward with things like, so does anything weird happen with you guys? And we're like, well, I mean, yeah, but what are we constituting here as weird? And they're like, do you get angry in a pipe burst or do you know when someone's about to die? And we're like, oh, that kind of weird. Yes, that does happen. And only a couple of my aunts kind of sort of whispered we're witches. So for me, it was something that kind of arrived in my life, and then I had to figure out what it was. So kind of the actual magic arrived, and then I found out that, witchcraft is actually a thing that exists in the world outside of, just fairy tales and stories and things like that. And so I ended up having to actually learn to use everything in order to get it under control, essentially. It was more of it wasn't so much something that I decided I wanted to learn and went out and did it. It was more of a necessity for me to actually learn how to do the things that my body or I guess spirit or whatever we're naturally trying to do anyway. So I had to then kind of follow up with that and figure out what was going on and then build vocabulary for it and exercises and actually get a handle on it.
Did your mother's biological family already have ways of kind of helping and guiding you at that point? Or was it like, oh, this is how we are, and then leave it at that?
It was very much kind of this is how we are. A lot of kind of, something would happen. Everyone would sort of raise their eyebrows like, oh, I don't know. It's just, it's just one of those things that we do and then kind of move on. But for me, though, it was very important to actually get a handle on it, especially because it seemed to be sort of in excess where I was concerned. So I was one of, kind of my generation of cousins that are all the same age are the first ones to actually kind of put vocabulary to it and call it witchcraft or this or that. Or so I have some cousins that are channelers and healers and other ones that are witches like me. And all of us are psychic to varying degrees as well, which is kind of the bulk of the family ability is centers around psychic work of very different kinds, depending on which one of us you're talking to.
Right. So what were some of the early things that you did to try and exercise and get a handle on what was going on in your life?
It was a lot of learning to do things like meditate, psychic shielding, so that not every, bit of intuition that I had was, screaming at me. I could turn down the volume a bit. A lot of it was kind of figuring out how to stop it from happening when I don't want it to happen. So that was a lot of work through meditating and breath work and understanding energy, how it moves, what it responds to, things like that was a big part of it.
So what would you consider your spiritual and magical practice today?
That is another interesting question because I feel like it changes day to day, at least kind of, what I'm doing or what I believe. Because I'm one of those people that, once I receive new information, then I change how I feel about something or change how I view it or things like that. So I'm constantly kind of evolving with it. Right now, it looks like a lot of folk magic. That is the bulk of my work is folk magic, especially from kind of a Mexican-American cultural standpoint is where I work a lot of my magic. So I work with a lot of saints. I work with Guadalupe. I work with a lot of novena candles. I have a bunch of them burning on my desk right here next to me. So I definitely work kind of in that arena mostly, but I do branch out to other things on occasion as well.
Nice. So what would you say is like something that kind of like, I guess like what's the most out of the ordinary thing that you've kind of had happen to you or had happen around you that kind of solidified your lineage per se?
I mean, as far as kind of solidified that, this was a thing for me in general.
Yeah.
It was kind of a combination of a lot of different things. Very, very early on, I remember one of my earliest kind of recollections of actually doing intentional magic was when I was really young. My parents had signed me up for t-ball, which is like little kid baseball, and I absolutely hated it. I was not good at baseball. The other kids were not nice to me. It was just, I was not having a good time. So I found out that if I could make it rain, then I wouldn't have to play because they would cancel the games. So I began to do that as a little kid so that I wouldn't have to play. And that was kind of my first recollection. Right, exactly. Yeah, a lot of weather magic, especially when you're young. It's I don't know, something about being a kid and having that super open mind to possibilities. The bigger stuff kind of seemed to be easier when I was a kid. But yeah, so that was kind of my first memory of kind of being like, oh, okay, so I actually intentionally did something and something responded. And then that was kind of the big like, okay, so this is definitely a thing. And, on top of that, of course, was the psychic abilities as well. I was having dreams of the future and then things would come true that I would see in dreams and all that stuff. So it all kind of just filtered in a lot of little ways that grew into one kind of big mass after a while.
Did you and your family kind of have like ritualistic practices together coming up, or do you still kind of partake in that?
A little bit. I used to think that my upbringing was super normal until not that long ago. Somebody asked me to like write down my witch story in like over the span of about 3 pages. And then when I did that, then I was like, oh, this was not normal at all. So I grew up with things like, of course, we have my mom's extended family who's a little weird. Like my grandmother, her mom, used to say that she heard the voice of God. And he would tell her things, very useful things. And I think it was her way of kind of coming to terms with psychic ability, that if she said it was God, that she felt more comfortable about it. Mm-hmm. But that was kind of, one of the things that would come in. But I grew up with a mom who would read tarot cards for her friends, at our dinner table at night, with candles lit. And I remember things like blue candles full of black glass that was used once to banish one of my mother's unruly bosses. So I definitely did grow up with it around, but it all seemed very normal to me. Until I grew up and I was like, oh, this was all weird. Not other people don't do this apparently. So yeah, that was a bit of it for me.
Wow. I know that like personally growing up, so my mom's side of the family is completely Hispanic, and like we're talking literally my family lineage, I've actually traced back to the Aztecs, and it's so weird. Like some things that happen as a kid, there's like certain specific things that like my mom and my dad were both Christian, but my mom would do these like little bits of unknown magic to me. Mm-hmm. like putting she used to put like a little a glass of water under my bed when I felt sick or when I had like nightmares or anything like that. And she'd put like a broom behind the door. She'd do like little brujeria things that I always thought was just normal. And then like, you know, just talking to other people, it's like, no, we don't do that type of stuff. What is that? So I kind of know what you mean by the whole
exactly
perceived normalcy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was one of the interesting things about doing the research for the book was I would sit down with a lot of people who were very much like you, because I kind of reached out to every Mexican American person I could find, every person who came over here, you know, from Mexico, and sat down and talked with them. And so I would sit down with people very much like you, and I'd be like, okay, I'm writing this book on, you know, Mexican American folk magic. And they'd be like, whoa, you've got the wrong person. I don't do that. That's not, you know, in my wheelhouse. I'm not a bruja or brujo or anything like that. And I'm like, just hear me out. And so I would start off with things like, you know, when you would get sick, what were some of the things that your parents would do? And then they'd pull up things like, you know, oh, my mom used to like do this thing where she would put, you know, a glass of water under my bed, or, you know, one person told me that like their mom used to mix up like the Vicks with like some of their saliva and like some salt and then like apply it in the form of the cross on them. And then, and it was so funny because as they would begin to be like, oh yeah, this was a thing that they did, suddenly you could see it just dawn on them, like a light bulb that just went off, and they go, oh, that's magic. And I'm like, yes, it is. And then they're like, wait, and then this, you know, like the broom, and then this over here, and then that. And I'm like, yes, it's all magic. And then they would like, I would just accidentally blow their mind at how magical their lives actually were, and they didn't realize it.
Oh, just thinking back, like how many times did my mom just go, you know, put the Vicks on my chest going, sana, sana, colita de rana.
Yeah.
And then I'm over here like my grandmother swears by Vicks, but no, we wouldn't do that.
Right.
Yes. So when researching the book, how did you find kind of your resources, or your friends, family kind of reached out to that, or people in the community?
Yeah, I started off with friends and family, people around me that I knew directly. And then they would often lead me to other people who they felt either had more experience in them, or like my mom at the time was working at a Mexican-owned restaurant. And so I would come in and I would be sitting there with waitresses and bussers and cooks and things like that, and them telling me their stories. And just so many of them. There was like not only things just about the folk magic part, but also things about times where people saw, you know, spirits like La Llorona or El Cucuy, or, you know, saw Guadalupe. One of them told me the story about they were running from the police and they believed that Guadalupe gave them directions to kind of like get away from them at one point. So it was so neat. And then once they were done telling me, then they would often bring in other people that they knew, or like they would call their mom to be like, what was that thing you used to do to me as a kid? And like, why did you do it that way? And then, you know, send all of that over to me, which was really helpful as well. So a lot of the research was just talking with Mexican American people and just being like, you know, and then comparing my own practice with theirs and learning and exchanging. And then that's kind of how the book was made.
And how much of that research do you think affected your own personal practice?
Oh, a lot of it. Simply because it helped me understand a lot of the whys better, because I had a lot of the hows, but the whys are the things that are the hardest to find, because those are things that a lot of times people forget about, or it gets lost, you know, kind of those things where it's like, and folk magic is like this in a lot of ways, but there used to be this old joke or something that my mom used to tell me about this woman teaching her daughter how to make a roast. And she's like, and then at the end, before you put it into the pan, you cut off the end. And her daughter's like, why? She's like, well, because that's how my mom taught me. And then, you know, so then she calls her mom and is like, well, okay, why do we cut off the ends of the roast? And she's like, oh, because my pan wasn't big enough. And so those, you know, the whys that we find out later, you know, kind of getting passed down are sometimes kind of hilarious, but also sometimes they're, you know, very deeply mystical. And so finding out the whys, you know, how we ended up with some of these was really neat for me. I
love that. Just you know, the whole, because I've I have countless stories about, my mom teaching me how to cook and, like say like different things like her mom used to show her. And it was just one of those, like, why do we do this? Why do this? And it just makes me think of like all the times where like, there's a deep significance and there was like, oh, because the pot wasn't big enough. I love that.
Exactly.
Well, before we dive into actually talking about your book, one thing I want to tell our listeners is that I have not finished, but I have had an amazing experience reading this book. You're just so witty and easy to understand, and just, I haven't taken a highlighter to a quote unquote witchy book in years. And I got like 2 pages in and I'm like, this is my book. I can highlight it. Like, it's not just drawing a totem or anything. I'm going to highlight some stuff. And I'm like texting our producer, Taulok, like lines from the book and making him laugh and him go, oh yeah, that's definitely true. And stuff like that, because as our listeners know, both Jera and Taulok are Mexican Americans. So I'm like the one person who has no experience or no real history or exposure. I haven't had any real exposure to this side of magic or folk magic. And so I really appreciate the work that you put into this book, how much of yourself you put into this book. But one of my favorite parts that I want to mention for people like me, white people, is that you give a really great explanation of why this is accessible to white people and why it's okay and how to keep yourself in check. And like, at first I was like, oh, I feel a little uncomfortable. I don't want to be reading this when it should be for somebody else. And then I got to that portion and I went, okay, no, you want everybody to read this, and you're giving us the tools to make sure that we're doing it appropriately. And I so appreciated that. I loved how you put it. It was just very kind and understanding, with the backbone of, but if you don't do it with respect, it's not for you anymore. And I appreciated that.
Thank you. That was a part that was very important for me to put in. I felt simply because once you put out a book like this into the world, you no longer have control over it. And I do want, people from outside of, the Mexican American community to read the book, because it's important to be educated on those around you and the cultures around you and, what is going on around you, because, and especially when it comes to, cultures and communities of color, because, it's been shown that if we are educated about other cultures, then we're less likely to be racist against them. And so I was really hoping that this book would sort of extend that sort of an olive branch to it. But again, I very much felt the need to also protect my community at the same time. And I wasn't comfortable saying, yes, this is absolutely open to everybody without any sort of, nuance or or anything like that. I didn't want to just be like, yes, come everybody, just steal everything you would like. So I wanted to kind of be like, yes, you are welcome here. However, we need to have a conversation. Are you supporting the Mexican community? Are you living in harmony with this? Are you creating competition for us and things like that, which are all things that we really need to be aware of in this. And we've seen this a lot happen with, indigenous medicine ceremonies. As a Native American person, you go to a sweat lodge and everyone there, including the person leading it, are non-Native American people there. And you're the only Native American in the group. You can feel very kind of out of place in your own culture. And so I wanted to sort of make sure that I wasn't promoting that within my own culture, but at the same time, keeping it open to people from outside of the community to learn and understand and even participate respectfully. That was important for me.
And I think you achieved it beautifully. I love how you gave checks and balances, not just things that can be used while doing the magic or entering the community, but like I want to incorporate those when I'm asking somebody to come on this show, and making sure that when I'm asking somebody of color that, or of a indigenous magical practice, that we're respecting that. And I think these tools can be utilized outside of magical work in the mundane community, in the mundane world, and just being able to have that resource written down. It's done very respectfully, and just, to me, it really was that olive branch that you mentioned. And it just really made me feel more comfortable being here in this space and holding this book and being able to gather what I can from it, and also to realize all of these connections. A lot of the time you're talking about community culture and how magic is still flowing through Mexican American communities. And I see a lot of parallels with Irish American communities or even Irish Catholic communities. And it was nice to be able to be in that moment in your book.
That's wonderful. And that's one of the things that I've loved so much is the number of people who've come forth that are like, I'm not Mexican. However, this helped me understand my Italian ancestors or my Irish ancestors or my Italian or Irish family, our grandparents, things like that. So I love that it was helpful cross-culturally for people to understand why their, grandparents or great-grandparents did the things that they did or believe the things that they did. This work is very similar to things like Italian folk magic. And I, of course, highly always recommend Mary Grace Farron's book, Italian Folk Magic. It's really beautifully done. But you can see a lot of the crossover and a lot of kind of similarities in our culture and how we work. And so I love that it was able to sort of go beyond just the Mexican American world and kind of impact people beyond that. That was unexpected, but also very, very welcome.
Yeah.
Aren't those just the beautiful moments when you realize you can touch more people than you expected?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think we're going to take a very short break, and we'll be right back.
All right, we are back. And again, in studio, we have J. Allen Cross, the author of American Brujeria, Modern Mexican American Folk Magic. And we do want to go into a little bit about the book. One of my questions is, what was the inspiration? Like, what got you going on this path to actually make this book?
Well, I had been wanting to write a book for a while, and there was a few different possible topics for my first book. And I wasn't sure which direction I wanted to go in. And a lot of people were like, oh, well, you're Mexican American, so you should write one on, brujeria. And I'm like, okay, but I don't do traditional brujeria. That's not something that I do. That's not something that I'm versed in. But people kept asking, and so I just kind of had it in the back of my brain thinking like, well, maybe one day I'll learn about it and then I'll write a book. And then I began to sort of realize, looking around at the work that I was doing and the work that Mexican American people in the community around me were also doing. And I'm like, oh, well, even though I wouldn't necessarily classify this as traditional brujeria, which has its own kind of specific method of working, it is kind of Mexican origin. And it's something that has been passed down to a lot of people who do this work. And when you ask people who are American, who are Mexican American, you ask them, what is this called? They still call it brujeria, because it's kind of like almost like a joke a little bit, because, it's like scary, it's that witchcraft stuff, it's that brujeria that your grandma told you to stay away from, like it's kind of tongue in cheek. And so I'm like, oh, that's interesting that we're still, using that term with our own kind of blend of something that is partially old Mexican versus new American, and we're still using this term. So I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I decided, I was like, well, this is a style of working that I'm comfortable with, that I see within my community. This is also an opportunity to spotlight a demographic that people like to pretend don't exist, really. Because when you're Mexican and American, the American people think that you're fully Mexican and the Mexican people think that you're fully American, and neither one of them really want you. So you end up kind of in this middle island place. And anytime we have this kind of our own, any sort of isolated population, you end up having your own folk magic. And so I decided to really kind of dive into what people were doing nowadays in the United States as the descendants of Mexicans. And the book earlier that I was mentioning, Mary Grace Farron's book on Italian folk magic, was a big inspiration too, watching kind of how she sort of unfolded her family magic in this book. I was reading her book, it was actually on my nightstand when I was like, oh my gosh, I could do the same thing with my community. And so I decided to do just that. And when I first pitched the book about, this is going to be a book about, Mexican American folk magic, and my publisher was like, yeah, absolutely, let's do it. Then I had a panic attack because I'm like, wait, I can't be the only one to speak for my community here. And it's highly possible that the way that I work is not the way that a lot of people in my community work. And so that's when I started reaching out to everybody that I knew and getting their take on it and how their family does it. Because very much like cooking, we were kind of talking about that earlier, folk magic is the same way, where from family to family, you will do things very differently. So we can all make an apple pie, but all the old ladies in the kitchen are going to argue about the best way to do it. And folk magic is very similar to that way. So I got to kind of hear how everyone would go about it and was able to kind of collect the common threads that everyone had in common and sort of unpack how that works and then kind of put it into a book. So that was kind of how I ended up writing about it, was almost kind of by accident.
Nice. So what would you say would be like the hardest aspect of getting this out there?
I guess trying to get people to understand what it is that I'm talking about, because a lot of people draw some very intense conclusions about who I am and what the book is about simply based on the title. Mm-hmm. People have misconceptions about it. So it's really funny. I'll have people come at me online about things that I supposedly said or put in the book that I definitely didn't. So I know that there are a lot of people who haven't read the book, who have just made assumptions kind of based on it. But once you get into the book, I do a lot, especially in the first chapter, of kind of unpacking everything that I'm talking about. What do I mean by American Brujeria? Why is it important? Who does this? Things like that. So that's all stuff that I think was the hardest part, is getting people to actually stop for 2 seconds to hear what it is that I'm talking about. And once they do, then they're like, oh, okay. And then they're on board. But the people like to draw a lot of conclusions very early on about things. It's just how kind of internet culture is these days.
Yeah, I do appreciate that very early on in the book, you give a good lexicon education on the word bruja and how it is used differently here in America versus in Mexico, and why it wouldn't be safe if you're using that language here and saying that's what you're doing. You don't want to do that or have that same conversation in Mexico.
Yeah, those are very different things. Because if you say you're, a bruja, in the United States, then you're someone who maybe has some crystals or, practices witchcraft in a manner that is resembling, their Mexican heritage or maybe influenced by that or things like that. So it's a very broad term in the United States. But when you go to Mexico and you say, I'm a bruja or brujo, people will literally run away from you because you just told them oh yeah, I fly through the night and eat babies and things like that is what you've essentially just told them. So it has a very different weight to it, depending on where you are standing in the world when you use a term like that.
Right. And before we dive into more content, when we first started before recording, we were talking about your cover. How much of influence did you have on it, and why were certain aspects picked?
To be completely honest, I had zero say in the cover. At one point, they actually asked me, they were like, hey, could you let us know some things that you would want to see on the cover and things that you wouldn't want to see on the cover? And so I wrote this long email about the important symbols that I felt should be on there. I really felt that Guadalupe should be on there. And these other things like scissors are a really big part of this work and like all this other stuff. So I'm talking about the symbols and the possible things we can put on it. And the one thing that I added in there that I really did not want to go on the cover simply because they put one of these on the cover of every Mexican magic book, and that is a skull. I did not want a skull. I specifically said that. Oh. And then they sent me back the cover, and I was like, I had a minor meltdown. But the thing is that Weiser has been doing this for a really long time. And they know how to market a book well, and they know how to get people's attention. And that is the number one thing that I get compliments on, is how great the cover is. So I need to trust Weiser because they do know what they are doing. But that was kind of a funny part in the publishing, because I mean, you know, as an author, you only get a certain amount of control over, you know, how your book is handled as far as, you know, what it looks like, how it's shipped, things like that. Mm-hmm. So that was hilarious, but they did in the end definitely do a good job.
Yeah, I will say that is definitely one thing that I've noticed with a lot of like the Brujeria books and things that I've seen, is that it's always a skull. There's always a skull on it. Mm-hmm. And I guess it is one of those, it's just a calling factor to it. It's like, you know exactly what you're looking at when you see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So, like I said, I have not finished the book, but I like how in the beginning you do a good job of kind of unpacking the differences between what you're talking about and what is going on in Mexico, and then explaining who is doing this work, who's drawn to it, and like I said earlier, how to handle coming at this from a white perspective. And then I feel like you do go into a lot about Catholicism, which I appreciate because it is heavily steeped in Catholicism, and like how we know as outsiders, how we know voodoo and hoodoo work is also based in Catholicism, and taking it and putting culture back into what essentially conquerors came in and enforced. I know because of our conversations, you do practice Catholicism.
I think I know where you're going with this. Okay. So how does your practice intertwine with Catholicism? Like what are some things that you kind of take and give from your Catholicism and the practice of Brujeria?
Well, I like to call it Catholic Plus, which is also known as full Catholicism, which is like, yes, Jesus, yes, the Bible and the saints and the angels and Mary, but also a whole mess of other stuff that we already know about. Because when it comes to folk Catholicism, what folk Catholicism is when you take an indigenous population from anywhere in the world that's pagan, and then you have colonization happen where they try and enforce Catholicism on top of what they've already had. So in Mexico, we have a lot of indigenous communities. You know, we have the Maya, we have the Aztecs, we have all of this that's already happening. These are all very deeply spiritual communities already. These are people who have already made contact with spirits and gods on the other side and worked with them and interacted with them. And so for colonizers to show up and say, actually, none of those things exist. The only things that exist in the world are angels and demons and God. We know that that is not correct because we've already met a lot of these things. So we kind of go like, okay, yes, angels, yes, demons and God, but also all of these other things that we know for sure exist because we've been interacting with them for hundreds, if not thousands of years already. And then we then kind of have to weave them together. And that weaving is something that happens on a lot of different levels. I mean, colonization is a very complicated process and often a very brutal, horrible process. Mm-hmm. But we end up kind of weaving the old in with the new to create something different. And so a lot of people misunderstand me and this work because they think that I just love the Catholic Church and Catholicism as an institution, that like me and priests and, you know, the Catholic institution are just best friends. And that could not be further from the truth, because actually none of this work that we're talking about is technically allowed or recognized or approved by the church. Yes, I'm saying a Hail Mary or an Our Father, and yes, I am speaking to a Catholic saint, but that's kind of where the end of the road is as far as Catholic approval. Mm-hmm. A lot of what we do is very subversive when it comes to Catholicism. None of this stuff is quote unquote like good Catholic people stuff. This is actually very heretical, but the vehicle that we are in is Catholicism. But the way that we interact with it and utilize it is not something that the church approves of or likes. In fact, they're very angry about it. So when people come to me and they're just like, oh, well, this is just Catholicism and this is just, like they have all this problem with the church. It's like, no, I also do not like the church as an institution. Just because I pray the rosary doesn't mean that I'm really down with whatever the Pope just said. Like, these are two very different things. So when it comes to folk Catholicism, I think that's something that's really important to understand. And folk Catholicism is the bulk of my practice. And really, we can't remove the Catholic portions of brujeria, even traditional brujeria. We can't do that because a lot of people mistake this for an indigenous practice, and it's not. It's actually, brujeria is a Spanish word because it was brought from Spain. It was influenced by a lot of different places. Brujeria is very complicated, and it depends on which kind of Latin American country that you are in, what kind of combination of cultures created it. But the bulk of it is something that was brought over from Spain, especially in things like the books of Saint Cyprian, which are also heavily folk Catholic as well. Again, this is not standard Catholic mysticism that the church is super into, but something else. It's kind of a more crooked version of Catholicism.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I misspoke, but I feel like in your book, you do say like that this isn't, or you give off that feeling like this does come from or come out of, but also it's not. And a lot of your conversations about going into the church is be respectful, but also note that the people around you aren't going to necessarily approve or like some of the things that you're coming here to do or that you're planning on doing when you leave. So don't be disruptive and maybe keep it on the down low. And I could understand and connect with those aspects as somebody who walked away from the Catholic Church.
Indeed.
So moving on, one of my questions, or I guess things I want to dive into, is that after you give a good explanation of what is the practice, what's going on here, you dive into different people or spirits involved. And all throughout the beginning of the book until we got to the Virgin or Guadalupe or Mary section, I had the question of how is she this most important character when in my Catholicism growing up, Mary was like almost, I feel like in comparison, a step down, whereas in a lot of Mexican American culture, I see that she's held almost higher than God or at God's level a lot of the times. And I think your chapter really gave me a better understanding of why and how, especially with the story of Guadalupe and how her temple came about and just herself. And do you want to talk a little bit about the Virgin or Mary?
Absolutely. So she's such a complicated kind of entity because people are often either on one side of this or the other, where you have people who are like, oh, she is not Mary at all, and that's super offensive to say that she's Mary, and blah, blah, blah. And you have other people too that are like, no, clearly she is Mary, she is the Virgin, blah, blah. I think a lot of her magic comes from the fact that she is both. She is in between. She is a crossroads spirit in that way, where on one hand, she is an indigenous goddess known as Tonantzin. That was very important to the indigenous people at the time of colonization. She was a kind of a Mother Earth kind of goddess that was very, very important to them. But on the other hand, too, if we look at the image of Guadalupe, it's clearly Marian in nature. Like it looks like an image of Mary, but all the symbolism and especially things like her skin color and things like that are all very indigenous. And so it's this very important mix of two different worlds coming together. And it was really sort of her appearance that I never want to give the impression that once she appeared, everything was okay, because that's definitely not how it happened. But she was such a symbol that helped the people get through that period, that everyone kind of could get behind. That was very important. So she is a character that is extremely valuable in this work, and she's kind of the central axis of it, because we have to remember that this is a spirit or an image that a lot of the indigenous people were most comfortable with. That wasn't Jesus or God or something that was so foreign to them. So she became kind of the pinnacle of the spirituality, of the belief, because she was familiar. She was something that they saw themselves in. So we ended up having her, like you were talking about, kind of ascend to a much higher place. And in fact, a lot of times people will kind of work with her in place of God instead, or as someone who has just as much power, or at least they kind of believe that. And so that's important to consider in the work. And we also have another layer on that. We have a whole kind of group of people that refer to themselves as Guadalupanos, which are people who follow the story and I guess sort of the teachings of Guadalupe, but are not Catholic, but they are just Guadalupe specific, which is really interesting to look at as well. So there's a lot of different layers to her, and a lot of people don't like there to be layers to her because they want her to be specifically one thing or the other, but she defies that, much like Mexican American people defy a lot of the stereotypes that people try and put on them as well. So I think she is a reflection of us as people, and I think that's very important and very powerful.
I've actually never heard it put so poignantly. Like, that's actually probably one of the better explanations that I've heard of it.
And that's why it helped me understand it so well. Obviously, being in the Southwest, I am, I guess, better exposed these days to Mexican American culture than I was in Georgia. So there was a lot of it that I'm seeing from the outside and going, I'm a little confused. So being able to read the book, like you said earlier, really did help bridge some of those gaps in my knowledge and help me understand and be more respectful and just understanding. I can say the word understanding 16 more times.
And now you can definitely understand a lot of the stuff that T and I talk about.
Yes. However, there's not a whole lot of conversation in Jay's book about shoes and your mother's.
That is true. That is true.
Which I think is good. Maybe. But less joking, more book related. And then you go into a lot of the other saints that are worked with a lot. I was amused that you started out with female saints and then moved to some of the male saints, but there was a definite more females, which in my church growing up, there was definitely more male saints talked about, and angels as well.
Absolutely. That's very common. And I kind of wanted to do that on purpose, simply because, everyone knows about, St. Michael and St. Jude and Anthony and Christopher and all of them. But there's so many really neat female saints. And what I kind of love about saints, too, is the things that we took as proof that back then that they are saints were also things that later we used as proof that people were witches. Things like immunity to being burned or drowned, or healing spontaneously from wounds, or things like that, were things that we used to be like, oh, that means that they're a saint. And then, a few hundred years out, depending on which saint you're talking about, we get to the witch trials, and suddenly those are the things that make witches. And so I think the difference between saints and witches are actually not that far apart in a lot of the stories. And a lot of the female saints have very sort of powerful stories, especially I'm kind of looking at my St. Martha statue right now, that her story involves a dragon that she ended up subduing and then tying up with her girdle strings. And if that's not a couple 1,000-year-old feminist symbol, I don't know what is.
Yeah, you go into that story and it made me so sad that the dragon died in the end. I was just like, people not attacking what they don't understand just broke my little heart.
Yeah, I don't know if I say this in the book or not. I can't remember. But some people believe that the story of St. Martha and the dragon, because it happened in France, I believe there's a specific town that it's said to have happened in. But they believe that the story of St. Martha and the Dragon was the seminal story for Beauty and the Beast in a lot of the ways, with this idea of someone who's kind of like a little bit of an outsider, young maiden that sort of tames this beast that's, maybe terrorizing the town or the town is afraid of. But then once she goes to show them like it's safe, it's okay, it's not dangerous, then they attack and kill it. So I don't know if that's true, but I would like to think it is true.
I like that. That's actually a good explanation for it too. So one thing that I've seen a lot coming up, just kind of doing research on the book and on you. One thing that pops up a lot, and especially being somebody that's by culture, the importance of the in between, of being in between. What, like, just for anybody who hasn't picked up the book yet, and because I know you do go into this a little bit in the book, what's for you, explain the in between.
So it has to be kind of explained on two different levels. So the first thing we'll kind of talk about is a liminal space. And in witchcraft, if you've been studying witchcraft for any amount of time, you've probably heard this term before, a liminal space, which is an in-between place, or a place where two things meet. So for instance, like a doorway or a threshold is a liminal space because it's in between two rooms. Similarly, something like the beach is a liminal space because it's where land and sea meet. Or most notably, a crossroads, right? These are where two roads intersect. And when you stand in the center of a crossroads, which road are you on? Well, you're on both. And if you're on both, then you are also on neither road, because it's this weird paradox, this weird gray area where some of the rules can be thrown out. These are very powerful magical places. This is where it's said that spirits can interact with our world, where powerful magic can be worked. That's why we hear about crossroads so much in witchcraft and magic and folk magic, is because it is a liminal space. It is an in-between, which is very powerful. Then we come over to demographics of anyone really who is in between two cultures, whether you are Mexican American or you are African American or you are Asian American. You often find yourself in between two cultures, where from the Mexican American point of view, when you go to hang out with American people, you're like the token Mexican. But when you go and hang out with Mexican people, they're like, no, you're white, go away. Like there is no, like you're kind of at the same time both of these worlds, and at the same time you are neither of these worlds, which creates a liminal space within a person themselves. And that means that those of us who fall in between two things have an extraordinary amount of power that folks are often not aware of, especially being especially experiencing being Mexican American. It can often feel very lonely, very isolating. And I wanted to sort of flip that script a little bit and be like, no, this is not about you being unwanted. This is about you being very powerful. You are a bridge between two different cultures, two different worlds. And if we would kind of wake up to that idea or understand that, then we can take a hold of the power that is inherently there, where we are not Mexican or American, we are both, and yet at the same time neither. That is a very powerful space to be in. And so that's kind of what I unpack it a little more eloquently in the book, but that's kind of the idea about being in between is not something that's bad, but something that's very powerful.
I definitely feel that on a spiritual level.
If you don't mind, I'd actually like to read. I highlighted a portion of that exact part of the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the part that I highlighted is, therefore, we are potent magical beings. Most of us are naturally psychic or otherwise in tuned. It is not uncommon for us as liminal people to experience paranormal or supernatural phenomenon more frequently than others. We all carry the blood of our ancestors who lived in Mexico, however many generations ago. You see, they knew things, powerful things. Abuela spent her life among creatures that most of the world would dismiss as legend, fairy tale, or myth.
Yes.
I can't even see you, and I know you have chills, Jera.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's something that I've literally been dealing with my entire life, and yet not knowing that it's there.
Mm-hmm.
And that definitely sums it up.
Another thing that I highlighted that I read to Talok that he literally went, hells yeah, to the only person El Diablo is afraid of on earth is an abuela.
It is true.
Yep.
She will come out.
Abuela and the almighty chancla.
That was one of the spells that I put in the book too, was somebody was telling me about how their grandma, or like a few people were telling me this, that they would put. So it's kind of perfect that you brought up La Chancla, because there is actually a spell that I put into the book that actually a couple of people told me about, and these were unrelated people, that there is a habit of folks to, like, when they enter someone's home and you take off your shoes, that they'll actually put their sandals, or, las chanclas, one on top of the other to make the sign of the cross in order to keep away bad things. And I thought that was hilarious, that we are using the power of las chanclas to protect us from the evil as well. So, also a benevolent weapon. And I think that's important.
I never would have thought of that, because I've seen that. Like I said before, my mom's family is from Mexico, and there's been a lot of times where we've gone to visit, and they always told us to, pretty much take off our shoes, put them by the front door. And one of my younger cousins actually would go over and just out of nowhere just cross the shoes. And I'm thinking to myself, that's kind of the weirdest thing. But now I actually realize that they were kind of inherently doing some magic.
Absolutely.
That's pretty cool. Well, so listeners, just so you guys know, unfortunately, we did lose Autumn. Her system did cut out, but we're going to go ahead and just kind of finish off things here. Josh, again, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and just kind of letting us know more about your book. Where can we find your book? How can our listeners get a hold of it?
Absolutely. So the book is available pretty much anywhere the books are sold right now, which is great. I do like to steer people towards their local metaphysical bookstore or local small bookstore that they have, see if they can order it through there or pick it up there as well. Especially our metaphysical bookstores are kind of the backbone of our community. So I really appreciate it when people can support them. If you can't purchase it from there, I also recommend going to bookshop.org, where a little bit of the money from the purchase goes to help support small bookstores as well. Of course, it is available on Amazon and all over the place as well. So it's fairly simple to find. And you can find me on Instagram at Oregon Woodwitch with little underscores in between. You can find me there, stay up to date with everything I'm doing, book a reading or a spell service with me, or peruse my Etsy or my blog. All that stuff can be found through my Instagram.
Oh, that's awesome. I know my Instagram, I have a bunch of underscores in it too. So I always tell people just underscore everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. And of course, once again, thank you so much just for taking the opportunity. If you guys have the opportunity to look up this book and to get it, I haven't read it yet, and I already highly recommend it, just because it's just from all the background that I've been seeing on it, all the positive reviews. They're just so overwhelmingly good, and a lot of people are just ranting and raving about this book and about this new book in the magical community. So thank you for being a vessel to actually get these words out here. And of course, we do want to thank all of our Patreon supporters. Again, with Patreon, we do have a lot of great benefits. We have an extra mini-sode every month. And of course, don't forget, we are going to be going dark coming up pretty soon after October, just for a couple of months because of life issues going on. And of course, our normal vacation time. But Patreon supporters, we got some new ones. We want to thank, we've got 2 Sarahs that have supported Patreon. And I believe that's a Michael, correct? Yes. So thank you guys. You guys are our new Patreon supporters. Make sure you keep your eyes open for some mail coming your way sometime in the near future. And of course, for all you active Patreon supporters, again, we do appreciate every little thing that you do for us to help us bring this awesome show and awesome guests, just like J. Allen Cross, to the show to have you guys listen. So, and are there any parting words that you want to go ahead and give to our listeners, Josh?
Just know that if you find yourself in between and you feel like you might be alone, just simply remember that you are not. This book and kind of the community that has been formed around it really proves that there are a lot of us here in between. So you are not alone, you are in good company, and you are a powerful magical being.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And of course, you guys know where to find us. We do have our Instagram. We do have pretty much just look us up on anything as Millennial Pagan Pod or Millennial Pagan Podcast. And of course, you can find me on Instagram as Hagrid Cosplay _ under all of those. And of course, on TikTok, AZ Silent Bob _ between those. And from all of us here at Millennial Pagan Podcast, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again.